I entitled this session, The Yahwist as Theologian, because the questions he asks and answers are basically theological questions. What is sin? Where did it come from? What is evil? How did it start? And then there are all of the things which in the stories are part of the human condition. And so the Yahwist begins to address those. And we've talked about the difference between Yahwism and Elohism. And the priestly first chapter, and I wanted to share something that came out of that. Remember we talked about God making the world and it was good? Well, I ran into this, and let's see how you react to this. An anonymous poet ponders the kind of dominion over creation that we have exercised so far. In the beginning was the earth, and it was beautiful. And man lived on the earth, and man said, "Let us build skyscrapers and expressways." And man covered the earth with steel and concrete, and man said, "It is good." On the second day, man looked upon the clear blue waters of the earth, and man said, "Let us dump our sewage and wastes into the river." And man did, and the waters became dark and murky, and the man said, "It is good." On the third day, man gazed at the forests of the earth. They were tall and green. And man said, "Let us cut the trees and build things for ourselves." And man did, and the forest grew thin, and man said, "It is good." On the fourth day, man saw the animals leaping in the fields and playing in the sun, and man said, "Let us trap the animals for money and shoot them for sport." And man did, and the animals became scarce, and man said, "It is good." On the fifth day, man felt the cool breeze in his nostrils, and man said, "Let us burn our refuse and let the wind blow away the smoke and debris." And man did. And the air became dense with smoke and carbon, and man said, "It is good." On the sixth day, man saw the many kinds of people on the earth, different in race, color, and creed, and man feared and said, "Let us make bombs and missiles in case misunderstandings arise." And man did. And missile sites and bomb dumps checkered the landscape, and man said, "It is good." And on the seventh day, man rested, and the earth was quiet and deadly still, for man was no more, and it was good. I love that. When I found it.
Where did that come from?
Huh?
Where did that come from?
It came from a little book called These Stones.
The Mark Link book? These Stones
Yes,
Will Shout?
a Mark Link book.
These Stones Will Shout.
Mark Link writes Bible textbooks for Roman Catholic religion classes. And he has three. The one on the Old Testament, one on the Gospels, and one on Paul, that are just, they make the best Bible studies, and I've used them for that. But I was looking for something else in him and saw this. And I will make you a copy. Anyway, I thought you'd enjoy that. our dominion of the earth has not been necessarily a good thing.
No, not good.
Okay, let's look at the questions. Have you ever done something you were told not to do?
Never.
Who was that?
Jay.
Well,
How
you're
many?
the
Only one. Today? Yeah. In the last 5 minutes. I know you
Hidden something because you were afraid of punishment for something you did. Think about kids. You know, if not you, your kids. I taught 5th grade for years, 10-year-olds. Have you ever run away rather than face punishment? Lord, that's the history of my childhood. I was a chronic runaway. And my father was an Old Testament prophet. You have to deal with that. But he was heavy with his hands, and there were many, many times that I wasn't going to go home because I knew I was going to get a whipping. And I stayed away. Blame someone else for something that you did.
Adam ate first.
How about the kid who says, I wouldn't have done it, but Johnny made me do it? How many times, I know as a 5th grade teacher, boy, I heard that all over the place. And I used to have an answer for it, was, the only answer I want out of you was, yes, ma'am, I did it, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Just...
I always tell my kids you get more trouble for not telling me the truth than you do for telling me
That's
the truth.
right. But they always have excuses.
The devil made me do it.
Yeah, well, I didn't do it, I wouldn't have done it if it weren't for John. Blamed God for a predicament you got yourself in. Or blame Satan. Satan made me do it. It's all God's fault. You shouldn't have made me who I am. I get in trouble just by being.
God's not finished with me yet, so give me a break.
Been so angry you wanted to kill someone. Well, I remember I was about 11, and my brother and I fought all the time. And I remember barricading myself and taking every one of my parents' shoes and throwing them at him.
Better than the anvil. Or an axe.
Knives. If these shoes don't do permanent damage. Acted with prejudice against a person or persons who is or were different. We've all been there. We've all been there. And you see my note, we are all children. There's a part of us that's still 10, 11, 12 years old. And this is the way we react when we get in trouble. And it's so typical. This is, our immature response to being in trouble. The Yahwist then takes the human condition and tells stories about it. When you think about it, isn't this what the first 11 chapters of Genesis is all about? The answers that he tells in stories to these questions. I want to look at Genesis 2. one of my favorite authors is a woman named Phyllis Tribble, who wrote some wonderful feminist theology, and in her books, Texts of Terror, she says of Adam, Adam was a schlemiel and needed a strong woman to help him. I think you all know what a schlemiel is, don't you? Hebrew society was dominated by men. The Yahwist society is very, very male-oriented. The Elohist society is much more accepting of women, to the point where later on there will be a problem with gods and goddesses, because women had such a different role in their society that the goddess Ishtar and all of her many manifestations becomes an important part of the Elohist society, which takes on itself some of the Baal society. El and Baal are like counterparts to each other. And because of syncretism, y'all know what that means? Where two religions are in a parallel place and take on aspects of each other. So Baalism and Elohism very often got mixed up. Yahwism never got that, because Yahwism was very male-oriented. Yahweh was a male god in a man's world, and there was never a problem with that. But the society that Yahweh talks about in these stories is very male-oriented. Women were the wives, mothers, sisters, daughters of men. Now they may have, there may be stories about those women, but those women were always connected to some man. And if you read these stories, you will see the connection. They are the mothers of the sons, they are the daughters of the fathers, they are the wives. Every story, the woman is connected to some man that the story is about. It was an animal herding community. The men herded the big animals, the women herded the little animals. It was the way they lived. They herded. When we get to Abraham, he was not only a herdsman, but he was a mule trader. So they had mules and they traded mules. They were not camel traders. That was the desert. These were on the edge of the desert, and they were traders. And that was the society where what they understood of human reproduction was what they saw in animals. And that's what they knew. Women did keep small garden patches. They did understand agriculture. They grew some wheat early in civilization. They grew wheat, but they also grew barley, and they made bread with both wheat and milk and barley. They snared animals, especially birds, and the women made leather goods, and they tanned the leather with urine. And that was, what they had. We talked about Ish and Isha, and One of the interesting things about Genesis 2 is that in the garden there are two trees, okay? And there's been a lot of conjecture as to whether they were the same tree or they were different. They are different trees. They have a very different role. Each of the trees does something different. One tree gives you the knowledge of good and evil. The other tree grants you immortality. And so when you look at the two trees, you know, symbolically, they have a different function. In Genesis 1, God made everything good. So where does bad come from? Where does evil come from? And the interesting thing about Judaism is that there was never, early on, there was never a concept that God didn't create it all. It was all created by God. Didn't differentiate. Whatever it was, God had made it. It wasn't until they were in Persia, which is very late in the Old Testament, that the concept of somebody else creating evil, Satan doesn't appear except in Job as a personification until very late in the Old Testament. God creates it all. And God is in charge of good and bad. And what is bad? Bad is the absence of good. Okay? Bad is the absence of good. Evil is a misuse of good. Money is a good thing. In our society, you need a certain amount of money to survive. You have to buy things. You can't barter everything. So money is not the problem, but it's what we do with it and how we love it or hate it or misuse it. But the same thing goes with the good of the earth, and you saw the little poem. Whatever we do with the good can be either good or evil. We have a choice. And God makes these two human beings with a choice. They are not Adam and Eve when the story starts. They are the earthling and his mate. They do not have names at that point. She does not have a name. It's an etiology story, of course. Where does evil come from? And instead of saying evil is seductive, the Yahwist says, let me tell you a story about how seductive evil is. And so he tells this story about the snake, although in Hebrew it's a serpent. The serpent seducing her into evil. Very seductive story in the Hebrew. He plays on her emotions. God tells Adam, do not eat of that tree or you will die. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't do it or you will die. And let's open our Bibles to Genesis 3. Everybody got a Bible? I hear sounds.
At that time, does Adam have, or does humans have a concept of death?
No. No. They do not have a real concept of death. And part of what will happen in this story is that they gain a concept of death from what happens in this chapter. They really, when God says you will die, they have no idea what that means, because nobody has ever died. Okay, somebody start reading, and we're going to read verses 1 through 7.
They're here, John is helping her come in.
Now the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat of any tree of the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, and he ate." You'll be going to do 7?
Yeah.
Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons.
Okay. Couple of things in there. Did Eve get the instructions?
No?
Eve doesn't get the instructions. Adam gets the instructions before she is made.
Same thing. Man didn't tell the woman.
He didn't tell her. Or if he told her, he didn't say, God said. Adam, Adam didn't. Okay, we know that Adam doesn't tell her the whole story, and she mixes it up. She mixes it up. When she tells the snake, what does she say? We're not to eat of it, and don't touch it.
Yeah.
Nobody said don't touch it.
No.
She elaborated.
Got her own story. Okay. Let me ask you something. Could Adam have said no? He got the instructions
From the boss's name.
from the boss.
Yeah.
Okay? He got the instructions. And she's saying, here's this wonderful apple. I just got it from the tree of knowledge, and I'm going to give it to you. And what does Adam do?
But Adam has to live with Eve.
Yeah. But Adam, Adam could have said, hey, wait a minute. We got an order that said we're not supposed to do this. And Adam goes right ahead and grabs a big bite. So the responsibility there, is not all Eve. I think there's some responsibility on both sides in that story.
Shared.
Well, what if he hadn't been there? Would she have sought him out?
Sure, she hey, look what I've got. Let me share this
But
good
it was
with
only
you.
the two of them. They couldn't have been too far away from each other.
Okay. Another thing, the serpent. Last time we talked about Tiamat. Do you remember Tiamat, the giant crocodile that they split to make the world? Tiamat is a recurrent character in the Old Testament. Whenever they talk about sea monsters, they always bring in Tiamat. But the serpent relates to the ancient gods of Mesopotamia. And one of those gods is the serpent or the crocodile Tiamat. So serpents are very bad, bad gods in the Old Testament. This is not the snake yet. This is more the Tiamat kind of god who is tempting her. But snakes have an important side role in this. If you want to call it a snake, snakes are bad because when they get in Canaan, you remember Canaan, the end part of where they're going. When you get in Canaan, snakes were an important part of Canaanite religion. And snakes had a sexual role in Canaanite religion. And so snakes are not a good thing to the Yahwist. Snakes are bad because of their connotation with Canaan religion. Snakes are also important because we've all seen snakes. They slither on the ground. They are very, very close to the ground. They also make nests in the ground. And they were believed to hold all the knowledge of the earth because they were so close to it. And so snakes had this connotation of knowing everything. So good and evil was one of the things that snakes knew about. And so you get this story of the snake being, or the serpent being part of this. And they're sort of interchangeable, the serpent and the snake. The other thing is eating. How important is eating in the New Testament?
Very important.
Very important. Eating is very important in the New Testament. Eating is Jesus' way of including everybody, is by eating with them. Eating in the Old Testament is how you gain experience. There are no books. When the Yahwist is telling this story, and he's not writing it, he's telling this story. When he's telling this story, there are no books. So how do you pass knowledge on? You pass it on by telling stories. He's telling these stories, and he's talking about how do you experience something. How do I tell you? I feed it to you. How many times have we heard the expression that kids are being fed knowledge? In this case, literally, they are being fed knowledge. And I'm going to quit there while we change